Everyone. My name is Seth Foreman, CEO at Socialsuite, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We know companies have spent a tremendous amount of time and resources conducting their first double materiality assessment, particularly the CSRD double materiality assessment, let me add. And the challenge is many companies are not clear on what to do next. And this is especially true with the recent omnibus proposal, which has created only more uncertainty in the market. So we're excited today that you joined, and we're going to be jumping into this topic to hear best practices and how to progress your DMA into year 2 and beyond. All right, so if you're unfamiliar with Socialsuite, we're a global sustainability and impact technology company. We specialize in double materiality software, and since all the way back to 2015, we focus on helping hundreds of organizations with simple, cost-effective, and powerful solutions, welcoming the likes of DirecTV and Double Verify, Cooper Companies, and many others to comply with global sustainability regulations, and ultimately helping them create value into their business. Now, don't forget that Socialsuite does have a variety of different content. We have articles, blog articles, we have webinars all across our website. So please do go to our website. You can see into the webinar section or our blog section, and you can see all different types of topics that we've built content around, so you can ensure that you're at the forefront of all the different changes occurring across the sustainability landscape today. Now, I do want to introduce Dr. Tim Siegemink van Hoekelum. He's our Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite, helping to lead policy leadership across our company, across all of our different products and customers. He has over 15 years experience in the sector as well. And he'll be taking us through the webinar. Now, I do want to go through a couple housekeeping items before we start. The content of the webinar will last about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to hold a Q&A session. If you do have any comments or questions, there's a chat box on the right. Feel free to write them in, and Tim can answer that either on the spot or we'll hold it until Q&A. We are going to be recording today's webinar, and we will be distributing the webinar at the conclusion of the webinar itself. So I'll be passing it over to Tim to take us through the content. I'm going to be leaving the stage, and then I'll be back towards the end of the webinar to wrap things up and get us over to Q&A. So Tim, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Seth, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure today to speak about the key topic that's on a lot of people's mind in the sustainability space: double materiality, what to do in year 2. Now, there's a key question that is really on most people's mind is around that double materiality assessment. Do we really have to repeat that whole process that we did in year 1 in year 2? That is the core question that we're going to unpack today in the webinar. We're going to look at the methodology then. What should we be doing potentially differently in year 2? And we'll finish the webinar with some best practices. So what are some smart ways to reduce your effort while still staying compliant? First of all, quick primer. And this is really important. Like, if you're in this webinar, it is highly likely that you know what materiality is: impact materiality, financial materiality, and double materiality. You've probably done many materiality assessments. The only key thing I want to pick on is here that when we talk about double materiality, some people still kind of wonder, what exactly are we talking about then? The version that is on a lot of people's mind, in particular when we think about, well, we have to do a year 2, that often means we're mandated to do a second year report and a second year double materiality assessment. We're talking then about what's going on in the European Union. So if you look on the left-hand side of this slide here, we see that double materiality under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the European Union is mandated for companies. You have to do this as part of your CSRD reporting every year. So once that first year is done, you have to do it in year 2 and subsequent years. So that's really important. You're mandated, and that's why a lot of companies are now wondering, how do I do that in that second year? Is it still that amount of effort? But sustainability is not kind of only happening in Europe. It is happening everywhere. Everyone is doing work towards more sustainable and responsible business. So there's another version of that materiality assessment, which often in terms of best practice follows very closely that same process that European companies are doing, are having to do. The only difference is that they use, in terms of the topics that they look at, not the ESRS topics, but they use the GRI topics for impact materiality and the IFRS or ISSB standards to look at financial materiality, their risks and opportunities. We did a really good webinar last year with GRI actually on how to do a double materiality assessment using GRI and ISSB standards and following that same process that European companies do, the CSRD EFRAG process. If you're interested in that, make sure you look at that webinar. This webinar today is going to look at double materiality in general. Of course, it's really focused on those companies that are mandated to do this again, but it goes for any company that's doing a second or subsequent year materiality assessment. So let's get to that key question then for year 2. And this is really what is on everyone's mind, is do we have to repeat the whole process in year 2? And why is that such a loaded question? Well, if you've gone through this process, you know that in year 1, that first time to go through that full materiality assessment, even if you might have done materiality assessments before in various shapes and form, that CSRD process is a lot of effort. It can be quite complex, particularly the first time. It's a lot of time required and resources required, and the cost can be quite substantial. So there's a lot of those questions that people have. Are all those things required again? Now, the short answer is no. Year 2 is not a full redo of your materiality assessment. What it really should be is an update. It's not a restart. Compliance, keep that in mind, doesn't mean repetition. What it really asks you to do is document in a robust way and in a transparent way, what have you updated? What is different? So use year 1 and build on that. And that's what we're going to look at in a bit more detail today. So if we think about that methodology then for year 2, what should we be doing differently? The key focus here in terms of a step-by-step methodology for year 2 and any subsequent year, the key thing to keep in mind is that what we're going to focus on is prioritizing change. So every step of the way, keep that in mind. And what do we mean with change? Is we're going to focus in this version of the materiality assessment on anything that's new, that is different, or that is a gap. And that gap means, of course, that you could have done something better, something's missing, something not compliant. So new, different, and a gap, really try to focus on that, on those changes. And to do that, we're going to create a little bit of structure as well. We're going to look at 3 core phases. The first phase is about reviewing and validating. And in that phase, we're going to look at what are the shifts in your business, identifying if there are changes in regulations, stakeholder concern. What is new information that we need to be aware of? Then we'll take that and we'll refresh and adjust. So we'll target some of the new risks we find or emergent topics or new impacts, changes in business strategy. And then finally, we're going to look at how do you document and report that. So it's about creating a structured process to do that rather than a full reassessment and an entirely new kind of setup for reporting itself. So let's unpack these 3 phases. Let's start with review and validate. What we want you to do and to start with is, let's call it a delta analysis. This is going to look at where are those changes, what is different, what are the shifts that you can identify, the changes and the gaps. So you want to take that year 1 materiality process and the results, everything you've done in that first year, familiarize yourself with that, and then think about where you are right now. What is the difference from then till now? And then let's focus first on what are the changes in your business. So make a list of any new acquisitions in and around the business, market expansions, new product lines or new services you're offering, or anything that has fallen away. Maybe you've sold part of the business or you've stopped certain product lines. Are there any new suppliers or key suppliers that you've changed? Has the strategy from the business changed? Maybe, again, linked to any of these other key areas. So really think from a business perspective about what has changed between last year and now. And kind of note that down. And this can be quite high level initially. And in doing that as well, you might be the ESG controller or the sustainability lead in charge of that DMA process. And you might give it a first shot, writing some things down, but make sure that at step one, you already start that stakeholder engagement. And what I mean with that is go internal into the business and ask people, get the key people that know these things, what might have changed, and have micro interviews with them. Sit down, ask them the right questions. So make sure that you don't operate in a vacuum here. That's really important. The next step then is to look at what's happening outside of my business. So regulatory updates. Is there anything new that I should be aware of? Is there a new ESRS standard or any other standard? Sector-specific requirements that are new or have changed? Any local laws that are new, changed, that I should be aware of? So really make sure you capture anything that is changed there. Then think about stakeholder feedback. What have you learned between last year and now? Are there any investor ESG priorities that have changed, or new investor ESG priorities in relation to, for instance, a new acquisition? Have you heard anything from your customers? Are there any particular concerns? And think broad and wide about that. So yes, you might have a specific grievance mechanism or a specific way of capturing that, but at large, what are your consumers, your customers, what are they saying and thinking? Is there anything different from last year? Any shifts there? What have you learned as well from the assurance feedback from last year? You've done your first materiality assessment, you've gone through that assurance process, and there might be areas where you assure asked critical questions or flag that certain things could be improved. So make sure you have a list of that as well. Then next, look at your peers and competitors. Who are the key people in your industry that you see as your key peers? What have they done around double materiality and reporting? So look at their reports, and a lot of these CSRD reports are publicly available. So find those reports, dive into them, and read in particular, of course, that DMA section. Read what's the process they've gone through. Look at the impacts, risk, opportunities, or IROs. How have they captured them? How many are there? And then start to build up a picture about what are my strengths from year one compared to my peers and competitors, and what are potentials and weaknesses there? What are things that I see that now that I'm aware of this, think we could have done that differently or better? Think about what else is internal? What else is there that you could leverage? So is there an enterprise risk management system in place? Have you leveraged that last year? And if not, what are your plans to use that? Are there any other audits or legal information? So what is available internally about any changes or shifts that you should be aware of? So again, like with that first point, talk to your relevant teams to make sure that you're aware of any of that information. Similarly with stakeholder engagement, if you don't know what has changed or happened, make sure you talk to the right teams. Talk to marketing, talk to investor relations, talk to procurement as well. Trying to get a lay of the land there about what your stakeholders have provided in feedback without directly asking them. Just talk to your team what they've learned. And then think about industry and subject matter experts. So that could be internal, people with a really clear subject matter expertise on particular topics or areas in your value chain. Talk to them, like I said, internally, but also potentially externally. There might be some key experts that have good insights on emerging topics. Now, this may sound like a lot of work, and yes, you can do a lot of this and spend a lot of time on it, but it's really meant to do as a high level, like I said, delta analysis exercise in which you get a good lay of the land, like what are the key changes? A bit later, you can unpack them in more detail, but build up that picture first, a high level picture. What you then want to do is take that picture of what you've learned in your delta analysis and take that to validate that internally with your teams. And that's where you might learn a little bit more. So take that, what have you learned? And for instance, look at that little sticky I put there on the right-hand side. And that is, of course, a very simplified version with some changes you've identified. But just for argument's sake, you've identified, for instance, that we've acquired a business that added 2 new geographies. We added a new product line. With that came various new suppliers. I found 1 regulatory change. And yeah, there are a couple of, let's call them issues with our dependencies and IROs. There are key things that I found out of the delta analysis. Validate that with your internal team. It might be your ESG committee, it might be a cross-functional sustainability team, but get the key people in your business to look at that and pick out things that you might have missed there. Make sure that you don't have any blind spots there. Then finally, you'll end up with a list of key areas for attention because you now have a validated delta analysis. So that's that step one. Think about what has changed, do that delta analysis. Now, in that next step then, refresh and adjust. I've worked out that delta analysis a little bit more. Again, it's still really short for the purpose of this webinar, but what we see here, and we're going to run through a fictional case study to action the delta analysis. There are key business changes. We looked at that: acquisition, new geographies, new product line, and new suppliers. We found some year one gaps as well. There's pretty narrow stakeholder engagement with pretty vague IROs. There were more definitions rather than really specific impacts, risks, and opportunities. We actually did not address dependencies, so that's something that was missing. And we find that looking at our peers and competitors, the number of IROs that we identified is relatively low compared to the median of what our industry has done. So that's something to keep in mind. And we found there's a regulatory change. There's an EU nature restoration law now. So let's take that as an example and look at how we can use that information then in the next steps. In step one then, what we're going to do is go back to our value chain. As you know, that is the first component. We're going to now add into that value chain the acquired business operations and activities, flag the new geographies, the new key activities around those product lines, where are key suppliers in there. And in doing all this, we do want to keep in mind that we don't have to be extremely granular. We really want to look at the highlighting the risk hotspots. So where do we potentially find key risks there? It's not required if you've added 100 new suppliers that every one of them needs to be named by name, but where are they? What are they doing? What are their operations, and where are the potential risk hotspots? You want to have that a solid value chain that gives you a good oversight of your key value chain components and activities and reflect those changes in the business. Now, with that done then, we flagged that as a gap in year one. We did not really look last year at dependencies. Now, of course, all these things that we're talking about here is for a fictional company. It might be very different for you. You might have done your dependencies. In that case, you're going to look at, are there any new critical dependencies in relation to that new acquisition? So get the key people in your business together and start listing out those critical dependencies. Link them to your existing IROs, and then think about identifying new IROs based on those dependencies that you have identified. Then we go to our issue register, or sometimes called the IRO register, in which we capture our dependencies and IROs. One of the key things we found is that our IROs were pretty vague. And what I mean with that is they may be really short, they may not have been specific. When people talk about SMART goals, they're asking you to really make your goals SMART in terms of specific, measurable, actionable, all those things we want to do for IROs as well. We want to understand where does it happen in the value chain, who is affected, what is the change that is happening. So we want to make sure that the IROs are really targeted. If you read a particular impact or risk or opportunity, it's immediately clear what we're talking about. It doesn't just say something vague like impacts from climate change. What does that mean? Impacts for whom, where, related to what activity, etc. The next step, once we've done that, we've clarified those IROs. And again, this might be something you don't have to do because you did a really good job at that in year one. Look then at, are there any new IROs? Any new impacts, risks, opportunities triggered by the dependencies that we mapped in the previous step, the acquisition and the new business line that we added, the new geographies, new suppliers. So go kind of systemically through that and think about what has changed and how does that trigger new IROs. You've also done a review of your peers and competitors. And while you did that, you might have noticed that there are a couple of impacts, risks, and opportunities that keep coming back. So consider those high frequency IROs that keep coming up for your industry and peers. Have you included those, and are they relevant for you, and potentially add them to your list as well? And then target to identify more IROs. Now that's something in relation to what we looked at. If you, for instance, identified in year one 40 IROs, and then you found that half of them, 20, are material. That's what you did in year one. Now, doing the peer review, you find that your competitors in general and your industry in general across the board identified 200 IROs and found that, let's say, 50 to 75 of those IROs are material to them. That might mean that you're on the pretty low end there. It might mean that you may have not gone deep enough or far enough or broad enough. So have a look again at your peers and competitors. What type of IROs are they actually listing? And what are some ways for you to identify more IROs? It's not about reaching exactly that number. It's more directionally to get a sense that, hey, maybe we should be doing a bit more work. Maybe there are more potential risks and opportunities that we have not identified, or there are more potential impacts that we haven't focused on. As a next step then, with that issue register now updated, what we can do is do more targeted stakeholder engagement. And a key thing, again, to keep in mind, this is all about being streamlined and being targeted and focused on changes. So in terms of external stakeholders, think about, is there a way in which you can have short and targeted surveys or potential other engagement, which you really focus on, again, the change in the business. So if you have new suppliers in ESG risk hotspots, how do you engage with them? Are there new investors related to that acquisition? Or are there investors with interest in new geographies you're operating? Think about what might be the priority ESG topics for them and the risks and opportunities that they see. In your new geographies or new regions, who are the communities that are affected? Engage with them. And we saw that for this fictional company that we had kind of noted down narrow stakeholder engagement. Now, one of the key things that we have seen working with a lot of companies is that a lot of companies in that first materiality assessment did some stakeholder engagement, but maybe only did internal engagement, or were very kind of quick to jump over that. So maybe this time around you say, well, we did only do internal engagement last year. Let's go out to the affected communities or to key external stakeholders in a targeted fashion to close that gap there and to improve our stakeholder engagement. In terms of that internal process around stakeholder engagement, we already started that very early with that delta analysis. You already done that, some quick interviews, but maybe you want to add to that as well the acquired company's leadership. Maybe there are new managers for those new geographies you want to talk to. And there might be some internal subject matter experts in relation to that new acquisition or key topics or geographies that you have not captured last year. So again, with that stakeholder engagement, it is important to do that, both internal and external, but be focused and targeted. What are the new IROs you've mapped? What are some of the changes you found? What are some of the gaps? What is new? And engage around that. With that stakeholder engagement then completed, we can look at some streamlined scoring and validation. So you have some new IROs, you want to score them, and you might have some IROs that you found that maybe you changed. Maybe you changed them quite significantly when you went through that clarifying, making them more specific. So you might have highlighted in that IRO register, issue register, the new IROs you've added, or some that you've changed to a degree that you think we do need to look at them again. So you want to run through that and validate also if any IROs from year one that you might have find questionable are still relevant. So in that exercise in which you add IROs, you also might have flagged IROs for various reasons. So you're visualizing the key changes, some new IROs, some updated ones, some ones that you just want to check internally with some of your key stakeholders, whether they are still relevant or if scores need to be changed. And with that, then you have a updated issue register and you want to validate that with the team again. So maybe you have another workshop with leadership or your cross-functional sustainability team in which you say, our IRO register has now been updated. Last year we had 40, now we have 200. What we've done is we've highlighted the new ones, we've highlighted the questionable ones I want to focus with you on today. We don't need to run through everything, but there's some focused areas and IROs I want to talk to you about and see if that makes sense. So again, be targeted here. And once you've validated that, we can go to that final phase there. Is we've done the work now. We know what material IROs we have. We know what topic standards on the ESRS are linked to that. So can we now document and report the outcomes of our materiality assessment? And this is about updating your ESRS templates or systems. So use the information, use the frameworks and standards you had last year to update your issue register dependency and make sure that you capture your justification for changes. And this is a really key thing that you want to start really early in that update is keep a change log or an audit trail. But a simple change log in everything you change or add, for instance, edit IRO 29 due to the acquisition. So make sure that you have a clear change log because that will really help you with assurance later. Then you want to cross-check against the ESRS. So make sure that your new IRO still align with disclosure requirements. So as you know, ESRS has your topic standards. Topic standards have disclosure and application requirements. And under there are data points. So you need to work out for new IROs, what are the topic standards they're linked to, what are the DRs and ARs they're linked to, and what are the data points, the DPs that you now need to disclose on. So for instance, again, in your change log, you may say, S1 to 5 biodiversity been added because there's a new product line and the IROs related to that. So that change log for audit ready documentation is extremely important. And then, like I said, reuse your templates and the documents from last year. What did you use? A dedicated software solution, go in there and use that to update things. But what we do see is that most companies have used spreadsheets. So you have a whole lot of spreadsheets and make sure that you go in there, find the relevant ones and update that. Now, the key question that we get then is, what does it actually kind of save me in time? If you do this process well, and if you really, and it depends, of course, all this depends on your individual organizational circumstances. It depends on the quality of your year one assessment. It depends on the number of gaps you identify, the number of changes you identify. So really the scope of that prioritized change. If you find that nothing material has changed from last year, everything's the same, you still want to run through this process, but it will be a fairly efficient and quick process because there's not a lot to add. You might do some internal engagement to check with stakeholders what has changed. You might find minimal changes. But for most companies, there will be some areas where there's some changes. So in an illustrative example, when we look at those key steps there that we just ran through, you can save some significant amount of time. We believe that between 50 to 70% in time savings can be achieved with a streamlined process and really focusing on that change and finding what are the shifts, the changes, and the gaps that we need to identify. What is new and what is changed. So this is something to keep in mind. Having a streamlined process in place that can definitely save you a lot of time. And this is the thing that's on most people's mind. Do I have to spend all that time, and often related to that cost as well? You don't have to if you really kind of systemically go through those steps. And to make that even better, here's some key best practices and smart ways that we've seen companies do in year one that you can apply to year two to really make sure that you have that streamlined process in place, but still also remain compliant. 4 key areas. And the first one is looking at automation and integrating data collection. So what we see is, and that's what I flagged, is that a lot of companies have used spreadsheets. Now, spreadsheets can do a lot of things. They're very flexible, but you need to build them. You need to understand them. There will often be a lot of formulas involved. Sometimes it can end up in a bit of a house of cards that if you change one thing, the whole thing falls apart. If you have not built that spreadsheet, your colleague did, and you're in charge now of the DMA process, or your third-party advisor built that, and you now want to take ownership and update that, we've heard from a lot of people that can be extremely challenging. So look at, can software replace your spreadsheet? That's a key thing there. Also look internally. What are some internal systems that can help me be a bit smarter around this? We've heard from a lot of companies after year one that they said, well, it turned out a lot of our risks, corporate risks, were already captured in the ERM. So if we kind of knew that earlier or actioned and leveraged that earlier, we would have saved a lot of time. So you do want to make sure, because you're running a sustainability focused issue register with your impacts, risks, and opportunities. Now, likely your business has a risk register, an ERM that also captures risks. You want to make sure you integrate them and that you not reinvent the wheel or run two separate processes for identifying risks and opportunities. And then look at, is there technology that I can use to monitor my IROs, how they change over time? So my Materiality software, can that actually help me have a clearer view throughout the year on what I'm doing, rather than making this sprint every year? And that's the key, what we find companies want to do. They want to move out of spreadsheets, which are these sprint efforts for a few months, and then there's nothing, into more of a paced marathon. Throughout the year, have a place where everything lives, where you easily can manage your IROs. And as things change, you can add, monitor, and update. In terms of stakeholder engagement, you want to look at how to optimize that. So focus on high impact groups and changes. So what we said is, look at where are potential hotspots, what are groups that are impacted, who can provide the best quality detail, and only contact your critical stakeholders, the ones that you can really learn something from. And make sure you talk to them in a tailored manner. So a survey with 40 questions or 40 topics ranging everything in your value chain, will that really be useful to send it to all your stakeholders? Your response rates are going to be low. Probably people are not the appropriate people to answer all those questions. So be more focused on that. Identify existing feedback channels. And this is a key thing I find as well, is that in businesses, there are often already a lot of stakeholder engagement. Procurement is talking to suppliers, investor relations talking to your investors, etc. There are a lot of existing channels in which feedback can be collected in a more business as usual manner if you manage to embed sustainability in those teams. Explain to them what you're doing. They may have been part of the process last year. You want to bring them on board and make sure that going forward, they're asking some key questions and doing some things to capture that stakeholder feedback on an ongoing basis in their day-to-day work. If you do any surveys, see if you can automate that process. Can you automate your surveying with dedicated software that's really built for Materiality surveying? And look at, when you do interviews with experts, structured mini interviews. And this goes back to the point, when you talk to a subject matter expert, they're really knowledgeable about a key area. So ask them about that. And it sounds very common sense, but often we still see that they get a lot of questions about other things as well. Really bring it back to where can they help you most. Rather go deep with them on one topic and give them 20 topics and get shallow answers. In terms of your governance and the roles, look at how you can strengthen that. So again, common sense, assign a DMA owner to oversee the process, but this is really important to have one core person, but also make sure that it's not just their responsibility in terms of doing all the work, and that's the siloed approach. You need one person to own the DMA and the updates, but have a cross-functional task force there, with people that are there to go to ask questions, and they can help you get stakeholder feedback, identify the changes in the business. I help you identify gaps, validate all the delta analysis, the IRO register. And again, cannot emphasize that enough. Document all your changes in decision making. So keep that audit trail and that change log. That will help you a lot with assurance in the end. Finally, then, in terms of validation and benchmarking, look at what your peers are doing. So in year one, that was hard because everyone's figuring this out, but right now there is a lot of information out there. And if your industry, your peers have not done this, look at adjacent industries, or just look at other companies and see how they've done it. You can learn a lot from unpacking a report and just getting to that component where they talk about their DMA and what they've done. Also use GRI and ISSB, even if you're just doing the CSRD, to see if they have any new updates about sector-specific shifts or changes. And like I said, monitor legislative updates. What is changing in the world? Doing those things will really help you be more streamlined and focused. So we're getting near the end now. The key takeaways then. Year two is all about precision. It's precision over volume. So it's a massively reduced effort and hopefully cost as well by targeting change. what has changed. It's not reinvention. You can probably use 80% of last year's work, but it's identifying the changes and the shifts that you really want to, that's where you want to do the updates and check. You can also generate a lot of efficiency by that automation and smart use of data. Like I said, use dedicated software to streamline and monitor your IROs and integrate your internal systems. Make them part of your DMA process. Integrate them with your dedicated software or your spreadsheets. Talk to the teams to really making sure that you don't have two data sets to work from. And then closing gaps really means strengthening your compliance. So find those blind spots. Look at those reports from your peers, competitors, and other companies. Talk to people, talk to practitioners, get a sense of where can we improve on year one and focus on those areas. And in doing that, like I said, you can potentially cut your effort by 50% or more while still staying compliant, because year two is an evolution of year one. It's not a revolution. Again, repeating myself, but focus on changes, on gaps, on automation, on technology solutions, and the smart reuse of data. That's the key here. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite Seth back to the stage, and we're going to see if there's any questions that have come in. If you have any questions, I would say put them on the chat on the right-hand side of the screen now, and we'll jump into those questions in a moment. Over to you, Seth.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. That was great. A lot of helpful information. So really, it begs the question: how can Socialsuite help? And one thing to make note of is that we continue to hear the same scenario with hundreds of companies. That the company conducted a CSRD DMA with a consultant, likely last year or the last couple of years. They received a deliverable of, many cases, we've seen them, 20 different types of spreadsheets, just an overload of data. But the company needs to keep progressing. And you have to ensure that you're managing and monitoring your non-financial risks and impacts, and you have to keep working towards compliance, particularly with the CSRD, even in light of the omnibus. But the problem is that it's really expensive and a very high cost and a tremendously time-consuming process to do the whole thing over again. And so that's where Socialsuite comes in. We have a fix, we have a solution. And through our software, we've developed a fully streamlined and compliant solution. And with what we can do, effectively, we can load in all of your DMA that's in the spreadsheets into our platform. We could run a compliance assessment to see if there's any compliance gaps. Our AI technology can run full benchmarking studies, both at a peer level and an industry level, to see if there's any additional changes or adjustments that you may need to make compared to your IROs versus your peer and industry IROs. And ultimately, our goal is to empower ESG and sustainability teams so you can take full ownership and ensure that you're compliant and that you can help create business value back into your organization. So if you're interested in learning more, you want to see a demo of our platform, go to our website. You could see there's a book a demo button at the top, or when we get to the end of this, at the end of the slides, you'll see our contact information as well, and where we can certainly share a lot more. So to conclude today's session, we're going to run a quick Q&A. If you have any questions from today's session or anything on your mind right now that you want to ask Dr. Tim, please add it into the chat on the right. Now, to start, I did get one question through a direct message. The first question, Tim, is pretty a short one, but how does the omnibus proposal affect our DMA process, and how should we be thinking about that?
That is an excellent question. And I think after the question, what to do in year two, the omnibus question is a very close second question that's on everyone's mind. Now, the omnibus is a proposal, and I think that's really key to keep in mind. The omnibus is a proposal to streamline some of the reporting requirements in the European Union. A lot has been spoken about it, but how it affects the DMA is that, in essence, it doesn't. The DMA is still part and parcel of CSRD. In that sense, you'll still have to do it next year. If you're still fall within the scope of CSRD, And right now, nothing has changed. There's only a proposal out there. So what that means is that you've done year 1, you have to do year 2 for CSRD. That means DMA is still part of that process. So that is really important. And with that, I cannot emphasize enough is that a lot of people have taken the fact that the omnibus proposal came out as almost it's written in stone now. Everything has changed. Nothing has changed. There's a proposal for change. And until anything has actually been kind of legislated, what that means is that you'll still have to report. You'll still have to do your DMA. You still have to move forward. So I think the key risk for a lot of companies is taking the omnibus as a bit of a break, a pause, a freeze, and not doing anything, and then realizing later, well, we should have kept moving actually. So the best thing to do now is just keep moving forward, do what you have to do under the CSRD. That means do your DMA. We also see a lot of companies that are outside of the EU that said, well, we're not even affected by CSRD, but we believe now that this is best practice. The DMA will actually tell us a lot more that we need to know, that our investors are asking for, our consumers and off-takers are asking for this. So this information, even though we don't have to do the CSRD DMA, we're starting this year. So you could even argue that if at some point an omnibus proposal would mean that you wouldn't have to do your next DMA, it's likely a good business decision to do it anyway. So short of it is keep doing what you're doing, make sure you progress your DMA because it is a very important piece of work.
Great, thanks, Tim. So doesn't look like we have any more questions today. So let's look to wrap things up. Again, thanks everybody for joining. We'll be sending around the recording of this session soon after the conclusion of the webinar. If you have any questions or you do want to see a demo of our double materiality software, go to our website. You can click on the book a demo, or feel free to email myself or Tim, and we'll be happy to set that up for you. Again, thanks so much for your time. Thank you, Tim. And look out for our next webinar, which will be coming up in May. Take care.